Hey guys, tonight we are stepping into the crackling, uncertain air of 1775, where colonial streets echo with shouted rumors, the metallic click of muskets being loaded, and the uneasy shuffle of neighbors trying to pretend life is still normal. You smell wood smoke, animal dung, and that faint whiff of panic that clings to a town waiting for war. And you're dropped right into it. You probably won't survive this week, and that's not me being dramatic. Between hunger, disease, gunpowder, and the awkward fact that you don't even know how to load a musket yet, you're basically walking around with a target pinned to your back. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, if you're listening while drifting off, drop your location and your local time in the comments. I love seeing where and when you all tune in. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step onto a cobbled street in Boston. It's chilly, and you tug your borrowed colonial coat tighter, though it doesn't quite fit. Around you, merchants mutter about shortages. Imported tea is now suspicious, sugar is expensive, and salt seems to vanish from shelves faster than toilet paper in a modern panic. You hear one man complain about the intolerable acts, while another says maybe things would calm down if folks stopped throwing crates of tea into harbors. That smell of tar lingers. Shipyards, always busy, now bristle with soldiers' boots. Red-coated British regulars march in precise formation. Their drums pound a rhythm that feels more like domination than music. You shuffle past them, eyes down, because nothing says suspicious like gawking. Every tavern you pass hums with gossip. Someone swears the militias out west are drilling daily. Another claims General Gage, the British commander in Boston, is preparing a strike. Historians still argue whether those first sparks of war were carefully plotted or just a messy chain reaction of accidents and egos. Either way, you're here, caught between it all. A boy runs by with a broadside in hand, a single sheet newspaper covered in inky smudges. You grab a glimpse. Calls for liberty, complaints about Parliament, and a crude cartoon of a snake chopped into pieces with the words "join or die." You mutter, "That's cheery," but the boy's already vanished into the crowd. You duck into a bakery to escape the press of bodies. Inside, warm bread scents fight with the cold air. The baker tells you flour costs double what it did last year, thanks to British blockades strangling trade. He shrugs, slicing stale loaves anyway. You buy one, take a bite, and nearly break a tooth. Hard bread, harder times. The streets aren't just about shortages, though. They're buzzing with militias, ordinary farmers with mismatched coats and borrowed muskets, drilling awkwardly in town squares. Their muskets misfire so often it's like watching a slapstick routine. One man sneezes right as he pulls the trigger, another drops his powder horn in the mud. A passerby shakes his head, muttering, "They'll never stand against real soldiers." Still, there's a stubborn pride in the air. These men believe they're part of something larger, even if right now they look more like an uncoordinated marching band than an army. And you're pulled into their orbit. Someone presses a musket into your hands and suddenly you're part of this wobbly rehearsal. The musket's heavier than you expected, clumsy in your grip. You fumble with the flintlock, half convinced it'll explode in your face. Spoiler, sometimes it does. That night, you wander to the wharves, where the water laps quietly against pilings. It should be peaceful, but soldiers patrol the docks, their bayonets catching moonlight. Rumors swirl that powder stores are running low. Powder, that magical black dust, is the one thing nobody has enough of. You realize grimly that your survival doesn't depend on courage so much as whether there's enough gunpowder to go around. Someone whispers about Lexington and Concord, little towns outside Boston where tension feels like a lit fuse ready to catch. You imagine marching there, the road lined with stone fences, every farmer ready to pick off redcoats. Another rumor insists the British are planning a night raid to seize weapons hidden in barns. Historians debate whether the militias actually had stockpiles as large as claimed, but in whispers and candlelit meetings, the stories grow larger every night. As the bells toll, you find yourself lying awake in a borrowed straw bed. The mattress pricks your skin, the room smells faintly of damp wool, and you can't stop thinking about the march of boots, the gossip of rebellion, and whether tomorrow will be the day when words turn to musket fire. The air feels tight, as though the entire colony is holding its breath. You don't realize it yet, but you're standing on the edge of a war that will stretch years, chew through supplies, burn down farms, and test patience more than bravery. For now, though, you roll over, hoping the straw doesn't poke through the thin blanket. You mutter to yourself, "I'm not cut out for this." And honestly, you're probably right. Morning mist clings to the fields, and you're dragged out of your thin blanket before the sun even crests the hills. A voice barks, "Fall in!" And though you're still rubbing sleep from your eyes, you stumble into formation with a line of farmers, apprentices, and shopkeepers. The smell of damp earth mixes with unwashed clothes. Welcome to militia drill, where your body's about to discover muscles you didn't even know you had. The captain, a stern man with a hat too big for his head, paces in front of you. He slaps a wooden cane against his palm and shouts commands. The problem is, nobody moves at the same time. Half the men turn left when he says right, muskets nearly clattering together. It's less fearsome army and more confused square dance. You cough back a laugh, but the captain glares your way, and suddenly you're very interested in staring straight ahead. He orders you to shoulder your musket. It feels like holding a log made of iron. You shuffle, trying to mirror the man beside you, who looks equally clueless. Powder, ball, ramrod, prime, aim, fire. Each step is shouted, and each step takes forever. By the time you finally click your flint into place, a British regular would have fired, reloaded, and fired again. That's when it hits you. This isn't going to end well. One mainstream fact becomes obvious here. American militias weren't professional soldiers. They were part-time fighters, answering local alarms, showing up with their own muskets, and drilling only when summoned. Compared to the polished regulars of the British Army, the militia looked like clumsy amateurs. Still, their stubbornness carried weight. They were, after all, fighting on their own soil, with their homes behind them. But don't let that fool you into thinking training is safe. One poor fellow rams powder too hard, sparks fly, and suddenly his musket explodes with a loud pop. Everyone flinches, a few curse, and the unlucky man staggers back with singed eyebrows. He'll live, but his dignity has deserted him. Later in the tavern, this story will grow into him, nearly blowing his arm clean off. People exaggerate fast in 1775. You spend hours marching in straight lines across the dew-soaked grass. Step left, halt, turn, present arms. By the 50th repetition, your feet ache and your mind wanders. Someone behind you mutters, "This is worse than Sunday sermons." And honestly, he's not wrong. At least in church, you get to sit down. The captain rants about discipline. He says without it, the militia will scatter the first time a cannon roars. You glance at your neighbor, who is yawning wide enough to swallow a musket ball, and you're not reassured. Historians still argue whether the early militias were effective citizen soldiers or simply brave placeholders until a real army formed. Both sides have a point. When the time came, militias sometimes stood firm, sometimes melted away like snow in April. During a break, you flop onto the grass, panting. A boy brings out a jug of weak cider, passing it around like it's life-saving nectar. The drink is sour, but at least it washes down the taste of powder dust lingering in your mouth. You overhear talk of drill manuals brought over from Europe. Someone claims they're learning from a Prussian book, though another insists it's French. In truth, most of these men are learning by watching each other and by guessing. That afternoon, the captain decides to test morale. He orders a mock charge, bayonets fixed. Suddenly, 50 half-trained men are running with sharp steel, hollering like banshees. You trip over a rut, nearly impale your shoe, and scramble back to your feet while the rest of the line dissolves into laughter. The captain shouts about seriousness, but it's hard to take anything seriously when Farmer Brown just stabbed a hay bale and declared victory. Yet beneath the slapstick, there's grit forming. Every misfire, every clumsy turn, every awkward laugh hardens into something resembling confidence. These men know they aren't professionals, but they're learning that unity, however imperfect, can matter more than perfection. As dusk falls, you sit on a split log bench, muscles trembling. You watch the red horizon and think about the polished, relentless redcoats who might one day march toward you. They'll be drilled to perfection, every step timed with drum beats. You'll be lucky if your line remembers which way to turn. Still, you can't shake the feeling that there's power in numbers, power in neighbors standing shoulder to shoulder, even if half of them still can't tell their left foot from their right. You stretch, wincing, and mutter, "I signed up for history, not CrossFit." Too bad, your membership in the Colonial Boot Camp is paid in sweat and aching feet. When you finally collapse onto straw that night, you dream of muskets misfiring, men turning the wrong way, and drums pounding in your chest. And though you laugh at the chaos, you also know war won't wait until you're ready. The next morning, the sky hangs low and gray, promising rain. You're told to pack your meager belongings and march. The word march sounds innocent, almost pleasant, like strolling with friends in a park. Reality, it's slogging through ankle-deep mud, carrying a musket that feels heavier with every step, and listening to wagon wheels shriek like unhappy ghosts. The road ahead is nothing like a modern highway. It's a dirt track carved between stone walls and scraggly trees. Rutted so deep you could lose a shoe. Horses slip, carts tip, and every time the column pauses, you're reminded that most of the army moves at the pace of mules. And mules, it turns out, have the attitude of teenagers forced to clean their rooms. Within an hour, your socks are soaked, your boots squelch, and you wonder if trench foot was invented just for you. The man beside you chuckles. At least it's not snowing. You laugh too until you realize winter is only months away. One mainstream fact you notice quickly: the American Revolution wasn't a series of grand battles strung neatly together. It was mostly about endless marching. Armies shifted constantly, trying to outmaneuver each other across towns, fields, and rivers. Distance was the enemy as much as the British. Some campaigns saw men march hundreds of miles, only to collapse in exhaustion before even meeting the enemy. Of course, the quirky tidbit is how often those marches were slowed by animals. Wagons carried gunpowder, cannon, and tents, but the real bottleneck was the stubborn mule or ox that simply decided, nope, not today. There are stories of entire columns halted while officers, red-faced and furious, tried bribing or whipping a single mule to move. You're tempted to join the animal out of solidarity. Rain begins to spit, then pours. The dirt road becomes soup. Your wool coat clings, and your musket strap digs into your shoulder. You mutter, 10,000 steps a day, they said? It'll be fun. No one hears you over the sucking sound of boots being yanked from mud. At midday, the column halts by a stream. Soldiers collapse onto wet ground, tearing into hardtack biscuits that break more teeth than they fill stomachs. You sit on a log chewing, while water drips from your hat brim. The captain claims this march is only 20 miles. Only. By the 10th mile, you'd sell your left boot for a horse. Some men sing to keep rhythm, rough ballads with verses that change every time someone forgets the words. Others whistle, off-key. You try humming, but it quickly becomes panting. The march stretches on, mile after mile, the road seeming endless. Historians still argue whether the poor infrastructure, muddy roads, collapsing bridges, unreliable wagons, was more harmful to the Continental Army than the British themselves. You're leaning toward yes, because right now the mud feels more threatening than a line of redcoats. As the sun dips, you pass a farm where children wave from a fence. One boy runs up and hands you an apple. Bruised but sweet, you thank him, biting in as juice dribbles down your chin. For a moment, the march doesn't feel so bad. Then a mule brays loudly, refusing to cross the next bridge, and the column halts again. Back to reality. You trudge on into twilight, blisters swelling. Every step feels like fire in your boots. You glance around and notice others limping, leaning on muskets like walking sticks. Nobody says much now. The earlier songs are gone, replaced by weary silence broken only by wagon wheels groaning and an occasional curse when someone stumbles. Finally, when the stars are out, you reach a field designated for camp. Tents are few, firewood is damp, and you're too tired to complain. You collapse onto the ground, too exhausted even to swat at the mosquitoes whining near your ears. The damp earth is your mattress, and you'd swear it's more comfortable than a featherbed. Somewhere nearby, a mule brays again, victorious, as if reminding you that tomorrow you'll be back on the road. Boots squelching, shoulders aching, patience thinning. You groan softly into your sleeve, thinking, I definitely wouldn't last a week of this. Morning dew glistens on the grass, and your stomach growls loud enough to be mistaken for distant cannon fire. Breakfast, if you can call it that, consists of a chunk of hardtack and a strip of salted pork that looks more like a fossil than food. You try gnawing at the biscuit, only to discover it has the density of a brick. Someone beside you jokes that hardtack doubles as a hammer if you're short on tools. You're not convinced he's wrong. Hardtack, flour, water, maybe salt if you're lucky, was the soldier's staple. Baked until rock hard, it lasted months, even years, which is why armies loved it and soldiers cursed it. To soften the stuff, you dunk it in your weak cider or stew, watching it float like a reluctant sponge. You bite in and immediately regret it. A tiny beetle crawls out. The man across the fire shrugs and says, extra protein. You suddenly aren't as hungry. The pork is no better. Preserved in salt, it's more like chewing leather dipped in seawater. You slice off a piece, gag a little, then swallow because you know there's nothing else coming. One mainstream fact: shortages of food weren't occasional, they were constant. Both British and Continental armies struggled to feed their men, and hunger shaped strategy as much as tactics. Armies often camped near farms or seized food not out of malice but sheer necessity. By midday, you're on forage duty. That means tramping into nearby fields and barns, hat in hand, hoping the farmer is sympathetic, or at least too tired to argue. Sometimes they hand over cornmeal willingly. Other times they scowl, muttering that both sides are thieves. You can't disagree. You've just borrowed eggs without asking. Historians still argue whether the foraging system was organized survival or legalized looting. Standing here with chicken feathers stuck to your sleeve, you lean toward the latter. You're not proud, but an empty stomach makes morality a luxury. Even when supplies arrive from Congress, the quality is questionable. Flour often arrives moldy, barrels leak, and sometimes whole shipments vanish thanks to middlemen selling it for profit. Soldiers whisper about wagons of food rotting by the roadside while they go hungry. The frustration simmers as much as the hunger. And then there's the fringe tidbit. Soldiers sometimes boiled their leather shoes into a sort of stew when things were desperate enough. You glance at your muddy boots and wonder if they taste better than the pork. Probably not, but give it a few days and you might reconsider. Around campfires, hunger turns into comedy. Men swap recipes for imaginary feasts: roasted turkeys, pies stacked high, mugs of frothy ale. They laugh until someone's stomach growls again. You contribute by describing pizza, which hasn't been invented yet. The others stare blankly, then decide you've gone delirious. As the sun sets, the camp smells faintly of scorched cornmeal, boiled roots, and desperation. You scrape the bottom of your wooden bowl, wishing for just one proper meal. Bread fresh from a bakery, butter melting, maybe even a slice of pie. Instead, you lick your spoon clean and call it dinner. You lie back on your bedroll, belly still hollow, listening to crickets chirp. The hunger doesn't let you sleep. It gnaws quietly, a reminder that this war isn't just muskets and marches, but the constant grind of survival. You whisper into the dark, I wouldn't last a week on this diet, and the night, cool and indifferent, agrees with you. The morning chill settles into your bones as you peel yourself from the damp ground. You scratch absently at your sleeve, and that's when you notice it, the itch that never goes away. Welcome to your newest companions, lice. They thrive in the seams of your shirt, nestle in your collar, and throw an all-night party while you try to sleep. You scratch again, and the man beside you smirks, holding up his own sleeve to reveal the same problem. Misery, it seems, is the Army's true uniform. You glance down at your clothes and sigh. The uniform you imagined when you pictured yourself in a Revolutionary Army? Forget it. The Continental Army had no standard look early on. Some men show up in brown hunting coats, others in patched wool jackets, and more than a few in ragged shirts that barely cover their elbows. One mainstream fact: Washington himself once lamented that his soldiers looked less like an army and more like a rabble in arms. Standing here, adjusting your mismatched coat, you can't argue. Your boots are another story. They pinch in the wrong places and leak whenever you cross a stream. You've stuffed bits of cloth into the toes, but that only makes the blisters worse. You wonder if bare feet might be easier, until you remember the sharp rocks and the ever-present manure on the roads. You sigh and keep limping. Now for the quirky tidbit, some soldiers dyed their coats with walnut husks to achieve a sort of uniform brown. Others used butternut dye, leading to an earthy, patched-together look that at least made them recognizable to one another. You run your hand over your sleeve, pretending the blotchy stains are intentional fashion choices. If anyone asks, you'll just say it's vintage. By mid-morning, the scratching intensifies. You hear whispers of men shaving their heads to fight the lice, and one man even tried rubbing gunpowder into his clothes as a remedy. It didn't work, but it did make him smell like a walking musket. Historians still argue whether widespread lice infestations caused serious health declines or were just one more irritation among many. Judging from your raw skin, you're voting for serious. Then there's the glamour question. When you first imagined yourself here, maybe you pictured crisp uniforms, polished boots, and neat rows of muskets glinting in the sun. The reality? You look like someone rummaged through a charity bin blindfolded. The only thing polished is the sweat shining on your forehead. During drill, you can't focus because you're scratching constantly. The captain barks at you to stand still, but the lice don't care about orders. They march across your skin like it's their personal battlefield. You whisper, "At least they're loyal," and the man next to you stifles a laugh. At night, when you finally collapse into your blanket, you notice something else: fleas in the straw. You smack one, sigh, and mutter, "Great, now I've got an entire insect zoo." The thought of a proper bath feels like a dream from another life. Still, you find small comforts. A camp follower offers to patch your coat, sewing crooked stitches, but giving you at least the illusion of sturdiness. Another soldier shares a candle stub so you can hunt lice in the seams of your shirt. You and your tent mates hold the cloth close to the flame, crushing the little pests one by one. It's disgusting, strangely satisfying, and proof that bonding can happen under the weirdest circumstances. As you drift towards sleep, the itch never fully stops. You scratch absently and think, lice, blisters, ragged clothes. This is the true uniform of revolution, and it's one you'd trade in a heartbeat for clean sheets and pajamas. The coughs wake you before dawn. At first, you think it's just a few men clearing their throats, but soon it's a chorus. Deep hacks, wheezing gasps, and the occasional groan of someone too weak to sit up. You pull your blanket tighter and realize this camp isn't just filled with soldiers. It's crawling with sickness. You stumble out of your tent and the smell hits you. Smoke from dying fires mingled with the sour stench of waste pits that haven't been dug nearly far enough from camp. Hygiene here makes a frat house after finals week look sparkling. Latrines overflow, flies swarm, and soldiers barely wash because water is rationed for drinking. You scratch at your grimy skin and accept that you probably smell like old cheese. The surgeon's tent is the most dreaded place of all. Inside, you find tables sticky with blood, saws laid out in neat rows, and buckets meant for, well, let's just say you hope you don't need one. The surgeon himself wears a stained apron that might once have been white, his hands bare, his tools unwashed between patients. Germ theory won't be discovered for nearly a century, so here, cleaning usually means wiping a knife on his sleeve. Comforting, right? One mainstream fact: battlefield medicine in the Revolution was primitive. Surgeons amputated shattered limbs because infection killed more reliably than bullets. Survival often depended less on skill and more on luck. You watch one operation from the doorway, a man biting down on leather while his leg comes off in less than 5 minutes. You stagger back, queasy, deciding you'll take your chances with splinters and sprains instead. But the real invisible killer is smallpox. Rumors spread faster than the virus itself. Whole regiments laid low, men covered in pustules, shivering with fever. You hear whispers of General Washington making a bold decision, ordering mass inoculations of his troops. It's controversial, risky, and historians still argue whether it saved the Continental Army or endangered it. For you, standing here watching men collapse in their tents, it feels like a desperate gamble. Inoculation is nothing like a modern vaccine. Instead of a quick jab, a doctor slices your skin, rubs in a bit of infected material, and hopes your body fights it off. Too much and you could die. Too little and you're left vulnerable. You watch one brave soul step forward, sleeves rolled up. He winces, bleeds, then staggers away with a bandaged arm and a nervous prayer. You quietly step back into the shadows, pretending not to hear your name being called. The quirky tidbit? Some soldiers believed garlic cloves tied around the neck could ward off disease. Others swore by vinegar washes or carrying lucky coins. You briefly consider tying an onion around your neck, but you're already unpopular enough thanks to the lice. As the day drags on, the sick line the ground. Carts carry the weakest to nearby barns turned into makeshift hospitals. The groans echo, punctuated by the surgeon's barked orders. You find yourself whispering the same question everyone else does. Which is worse, the enemy's musket or the camp's disease? That night, as you settle onto your damp blanket, you can't shake the images. The pale faces, the surgeon's saw, the coughing that won't stop. You pull the blanket tighter and whisper, "I probably wouldn't last a week of this." And the coughing chorus in the dark seems to agree. The morning fog hasn't even burned off when you're yanked from your thin sleep and herded back onto the training field. Today, the captain promises, you'll finally learn to fight like real soldiers. That sounds encouraging until you remember yesterday's bayonet mishap, where a hay bale became the most tragic casualty of camp. Still, you shuffle into line, musket clutched, trying not to look too nervous. The drums start, steady and relentless, guiding your steps. You're ordered into formation, 3 ranks deep, men shoulder to shoulder, muskets pointed outward like bristling thorns. The captain paces with exaggerated importance. "War is about order," he bellows. "Volley fire wins battles." You nod, though inside you're thinking, actually, I'm just trying not to sneeze on the guy in front of me. One mainstream fact, 18th century tactics relied heavily on volley fire. Muskets fired in unison, rank after rank, to unleash walls of lead. Accuracy didn't matter much. What counted was volume. You picture hundreds of muskets cracking at once, smoke billowing, and realize, this is less sharpshooting and more organized chaos. You fumble through the steps, prime the pan, ram the ball, level the musket, and fire! The volley erupts. Your musket kicks back hard, smoke choking your throat, ears ringing. For a moment, you can't see more than a few feet ahead. You imagine an actual battlefield where both sides blast away in rolling waves, each trying to hold steady while their ears buzz and lungs burn. Then comes the dreaded bayonet drill. Long, triangular steel blades glint in the sun as men fix them onto muzzles. The captain orders you forward. "Charge!" he roars. You stumble with the line, shouting hoarsely, jabbing at straw dummies planted in the dirt. The thrust feels clumsy, but the sound of 50 men yelling at once carries a strange energy, half terrifying, half ridiculous. The quirky tidbit? Some soldiers nicknamed bayonets tulips because of the triangular shape, though there was nothing flowery about being on the wrong end. Others swore the very sight of a charge sent opponents running before steel even touched flesh. You jab again, hoping the enemy would indeed run before you ever had to use this thing. Yet not everyone follows the script. Skirmishers, men trained to dart through woods, take cover, and fire from distance, challenge these rigid lines. They're more like hunters than soldiers. And while European generals sneer at such irregular methods, colonials quietly embrace them. Historians still argue whether it was discipline in line or flexibility in skirmishes that ultimately gave the rebels their edge. Watching men practice both, you suspect the answer is a messy combination. By midday, you're soaked in sweat, your shoulder bruised from recoil. You collapse onto the grass, clutching your musket like it's a sullen pet that refuses to behave. The man beside you grins and says, "Don't worry, you'll get used to it." You don't believe him. Afternoon drills continue until the light fades. Drums pound, boots stomp, muskets crack. You feel less like a person and more like a cog in a noisy, smoky machine. And yet, beneath the exhaustion, you sense a strange rhythm forming. You move almost without thinking, reloading faster, keeping step, shouting with the others. When the captain finally dismisses you, you drag yourself toward camp, arms aching, ears still ringing. You mutter volley fire, bayonets, lines, and smoke. Who thought this was a good idea? And though nobody answers, the memory of those thunderous volleys lingers, rattling your ribs even as you sink wearily onto your blanket. The morning fog lifts into a pale sky, and before you've even finished gnawing at your breakfast biscuit, the alarm comes. British troops on the move. Suddenly, all the drills, the marches, the bruised shoulders from musket recoil, they all feel terrifyingly real. You grab your musket, heart pounding, and stumble into line. You march toward the sound of drums and then, boom. The first cannon thunders in the distance. A vibration shivers up your legs, and even before the smoke drifts your way, you taste sulfur on the air. Then the musket fire begins, crackling, relentless, like thunder made of metal. You step onto the battlefield, and chaos swallows you whole. Smoke rolls thick across the fields, white-gray clouds that blur friend from foe. You can barely see the man in front of you, yet you hear him coughing, shouting, firing again. The air stinks of powder, sweat, and fear. One mainstream fact: revolutionary battles often became disorienting maelstroms. With smoothbore muskets inaccurate beyond 100 yards and clouds of black powder choking vision, soldiers frequently fired blindly into the haze. The neat lines you practiced in camp, they dissolve quickly once real bullets fly. You lift your musket, fire, and stumble back as the recoil slams your shoulder. Did you hit anything? You'll never know. The smoke makes everything look like a ghost story. A man next to you reloads frantically, only to drop his ramrod and curse so loudly it almost drowns out the musket fire. Almost. And here's a quirky tidbit. Sometimes battles were interrupted by flocks of terrified birds. Cannons sent hundreds of pigeons or crows screaming into the sky, adding another layer of noise to the already unbearable din. For a moment, you think you see birds wheeling overhead until you realize it's just blackened scraps of paper from a nearby cart set aflame. Then comes the yelling. Officers bellowing orders, drummers pounding, men screaming in pain or panic. The sound merges into one massive roar that rattles inside your skull. You try to follow commands, but words dissolve in the din. Someone shouts, "Advance!" while another cries, "Retreat!" You stand frozen, musket half loaded, wishing someone would just hand out maps with arrows and a nice color-coded plan. Historians still argue whether discipline or sheer stubborn courage mattered more in battles like this. You watch as some men hold their ground, teeth clenched, while others break and run for the tree line. You want to believe training matters, but right now, it feels like survival is pure chance. A gust of wind clears the smoke for a moment, and you see it, the red wall of British soldiers across the field, bayonets flashing. Your stomach lurches. The officer waves his sword, shouting, and your line shuffles forward. The crack of muskets intensifies, louder, closer. You fire again, not even aiming, just pulling the trigger as fast as your shaking hands allow. Then a cannonball plows into the earth a few feet away, showering you with dirt. You hit the ground instinctively, ears ringing. Your thoughts blur. Why am I here? How am I still alive? You scramble back into line, legs trembling like saplings in a storm. Minutes stretch like hours. Smoke swirls, muskets snap, voices rise and fall. At some point, you realize your powder horn is nearly empty. You wonder if you'll survive long enough to worry about food again. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the firing slackens. Orders are shouted to pull back. You stagger with the others, stumbling over churned earth and bodies hidden by haze. Your lungs burn, ears buzz, and the world tilts sideways. The only thing you know is that you're still standing. That night, back at camp, you collapse into the dirt, clothes reeking of powder. You close your eyes, but the thunder of muskets echoes behind your eyelids. The smoke still stings your nose. You whisper, "I wouldn't last a week of this." And for once, nobody argues. You wake to whispers, the kind that skitter like mice in the corners of camp. Only this time, they aren't about food or pay. They're about secrets. Someone says the British know too much, someone else insists there's a spy in camp, and suddenly your morning hardtack feels like it's watching you. Before long, you're dragged into the strange twilight world of espionage. A fellow soldier nudges you and slips a folded scrap into your hand. At first glance, it looks blank, just an ordinary sheet. But he whispers, "Heat it near a candle." Later, in the dim glow, spidery words appear, written in invisible ink made from lemon juice. You squint, amazed, until the edge of the page singes and you realize this is both genius and a fire hazard. Here's the mainstream fact. The Revolutionary War relied heavily on spy networks. Washington himself managed the famous Culper Ring, which funneled intelligence from British-occupied New York back to American commanders. They used codes, dead drops, and even laundry lines, arranged clothes on a line signaling where enemy ships were anchored. Suddenly, you look at every shirt in camp like it might be tattling. The quirky tidbit? Some spies wrote with sympathetic ink, which required heat or chemicals to reveal. Others carried messages hidden in quills or sewn into buttons. One rumor claims a letter was once tucked into a hollowed-out bullet. You try not to imagine accidentally firing your commander's grocery list across enemy lines. You shuffle through shadows with others, rehearsing fake stories to tell if captured. "I'm just delivering flour," someone mutters, though he's carrying no flour. Another guy insists he'll pretend to be lost. You silently debate whether you'd fold instantly under interrogation. Spoiler, probably yes. Historians still argue whether spies truly tipped the balance or merely added drama to a war already decided by supply chains and alliances. Standing here, with sweat trickling as you imagine a rope tightening around your neck for treason, you lean towards spies being a little more than window dressing. At night, you're stationed near a barn where a friendly farmer supposedly leaves coded messages. Every creak makes your nerves twitch. An owl hoots, and you nearly bayonet a fence post. Hours drag by, until finally a slip of paper tucked into a hollow stick changes hands. You hold it for a moment, heart racing, though you don't understand the code. A line of numbers, a few names, and suddenly you realize your life could end over this scrap you can't even read. Back in camp, soldiers argue about loyalty. Some men mutter about deserters who may have turned spy for the crown. Others swear half the taverns in Philadelphia are crawling with informants. The war suddenly feels less like lines of muskets and more like whispers you can't escape. By morning, the rumors swirl again. A man was caught passing notes. Another vanished entirely. You keep your head down, wondering how many invisible eyes are watching. You used to fear redcoats. Now you fear laundry lines, lemon juice, and neighbors who smile too wide. You shuffle into a small town, boots caked with mud, expecting the usual mix of bread smells and gossip. Instead, the air hums with something sharper: resentment, suspicion, the kind that prickles your skin. Half the people glare at you for being a rebel soldier. The other half glare at their neighbors for not being rebel soldiers. Welcome to the fractured world of loyalists and patriots. You're sent to quarter in a tavern, and the innkeeper's smile is so thin it could slice cheese. She serves you ale, but her eyes dart toward a portrait of the king on the wall. You're tempted to drink quickly and leave before she decides to water your beer with something less wholesome. Here's the mainstream fact. During the Revolution, about a fifth of colonists stayed loyal to Britain, while another chunk tried desperately to remain neutral. Families split, neighbors spied, even churches divided. One sermon praising liberty, the next condemning rebellion as sin. The quirky tidbit? Some loyalists wore green ribbons in their hats as subtle signals of allegiance. Others left pineapples carved above their doors, a symbol of hospitality that sometimes doubled as code for redcoat sympathizer here. You glance at door frames nervously, wondering if that decorative fruit means friendship or betrayal. The town square erupts into an argument when soldiers requisition supplies. One farmer snarls, "You're no better than the British." Another counters, "At least these lads fight for us." Meanwhile, you just stand there holding a sack of flour, praying no one asks where your loyalties truly lie. Historians still argue whether the Revolution was truly a war of independence or more of a messy civil war between neighbors. Watching a shopkeeper slam her shutters at the sight of your uniform, you lean toward the latter. It feels less like a united struggle and more like an endless feud where everyone suspects everyone else. Later that night, you hear muffled shouting through a thin wall. The tavern keeper's son wants to join the Continental Army. His father threatens to disown him if he does. You lie awake, listening to voices rise and fall, realizing the battlefield extends right into people's homes. By dawn, the town is quieter but not calmer. You catch a glimpse of the innkeeper burning a letter before you leave. Was it just old kindling, or was it proof of her loyalties? You'll never know, and maybe that's worse. because here, trust feels rarer than powder and twice as dangerous. Morning brings no rest. You're marched again, but instead of drills or dusty towns, you enter a sprawling camp buzzing with voices that don't sound like soldiers barking orders. Women stir pots that hiss with steam. Children chase each other between tents. A baby wails, and someone mutters that if the cannon fire doesn't wake the whole forest, that cry surely will. You've stumbled into the world of camp followers, the women, children, and laborers who travel with the army. They aren't on the muster rolls, but without them, you suspect half the soldiers wouldn't survive a week. A woman ladles stew into a dented tin bowl for you, and the smell of something vaguely like meat almost makes you weep. Here's the mainstream fact. Thousands of women followed both the Continental and British armies. They cooked, laundered, mended uniforms, and nursed the sick. Some were paid a small allowance, most were not. Their labor kept camps from collapsing into filth and starvation. The quirky tidbit? A few women disguised themselves as men and fought in battle. Deborah Sampson is one of the most famous, serving for over a year before discovery. You eye the wiry boy hauling water beside you and wonder, briefly, whether you're in on another of history's secrets. In the smoky tent where wounds are tended, you watch women grinding herbs, stitching gashes, and spooning broth into trembling mouths. They work with a steady focus that makes your musket drills seem like child's play. Meanwhile, you're trying not to faint at the sight of a man getting his foot wrapped in linen, stiff with blood. Historians still argue whether these women were tolerated out of necessity or whether their presence reshaped the very structure of the armies. Some officers complained they slowed marches. Others admitted, grudgingly, that without them, half the soldiers would desert in search of food and clean shirts. Night settles, and fires crackle. You hear laughter from a circle where women patch trousers by firelight while soldiers hum off-key tunes. For a moment, the war feels less like endless drills and more like a strange, stumbling community. A woman scolds you for sitting in torn stockings and thrusts a needle into your hand. You prick your thumb instantly, earning a round of chuckles. When you finally lie down, belly warmed by stew, the camp doesn't sound like an army anymore. It sounds like a rough, stubborn village, one that somehow trudges forward even when muskets, hunger, and doubt gnaw at its edges. You wake to the smell of wood smoke and the sound of uneasy voices. Today's march doesn't lead to tidy fields or bustling towns. Instead, you find yourself edging into dense forests where the trees close in and the air feels thicker, as though even the land itself is holding its breath. Officers warn you in hushed tones. Here, alliances twist like vines. Native nations hover on the edges of this war, and you quickly realize their role is anything but simple. Some groups side with the British, others with the Americans, and many try desperately to steer clear of both. But the revolution's lines don't respect borders, and soon neither do you. Here's the mainstream fact. The Iroquois Confederacy split during the conflict. While the Mohawk and Seneca largely fought alongside the British, the Oneida and Tuscarora supported the Americans. That fracture left scars that lasted long after the war ended. You trudge along a path where charred cabins still smolder. Farmers mutter that raids tore through in the night. Crops are trampled, livestock gone. One man says his neighbor's family vanished into the forest. Whether fleeing or taken, no one can agree. You stare at the blackened ruins and wonder how anyone rebuilds when flames keep coming back. The quirky tidbit? Some scouts carried rattles or painted their faces before slipping into the woods, believing it sharpened their senses or unsettled their enemies. You can't decide if it's intimidation or simply survival through ritual. Either way, when you hear a rustle in the brush, your imagination fills with painted faces you can't see. Historians still argue whether native nations were true allies in these fights or pawns caught in a struggle that had little to do with their sovereignty. Watching a Seneca warrior stride past, muskets slung with quiet confidence, you doubt the word pawn applies at all. By dusk, you huddle near the campfire, the forest pressing close around you. Every snap of a twig makes you flinch. You realize this war is no longer lines of muskets on open fields. It's shadows moving between trees, raids at midnight, whispers of alliances you don't understand. And here in this borderland, you wouldn't last a week. Not against hunger, not against fire, and certainly not against the silence that follows both. The next march doesn't end in forest or field, but at a wide, restless river. You hear gulls before you see the water, and when it comes into view, it stretches like a gray ribbon, waves slapping against the hulls of creaking boats tied along the shore. The war is no longer just about muddy roads and smoky fields. It spills onto the water too. You're herded aboard a vessel that smells of tar, sweat, and something that might once have been fish. The deck pitches under your boots, and you cling to the rigging like a nervous cat. Sailors move with casual balance, hauling ropes, cursing the wind, and glaring at you for being in the way. Here's the mainstream fact. The Continental Navy was tiny compared to Britain's massive fleet, but it still harassed supply ships, captured prizes, and forced the Royal Navy to stretch itself thin. Privateers essentially legalized pirates, added to the chaos, raiding merchant vessels under Congress's blessing. The quirky tidbit? Some crews name their cannons, painting faces or writing little mottos along the barrels. One gun was reportedly christened Old Sow, and its thunderous boom gave sailors an odd sense of comfort. You pat the nearest cannon nervously, half expecting it to grunt back. Then the enemy appears. Sails on the horizon, white triangles against the steel sky. Drums beat, orders fly, and suddenly the calm river feels like a trap about to snap shut. The ship lurches as sails catch, and your stomach lurches with it. Cannons roll into place, ropes creak, and your ears ring even before the first shot. Boom! The world splits open, smoke gushes, the deck quakes, and splinters rain down. You duck, heart hammering, while sailors cheer like this is a tavern game. Another volley answers from across the water, cannonballs splashing close enough to drench your boots. Historians still argue whether the naval war truly mattered. Was it decisive or just a noisy sideshow? Standing here, soaked, ears ringing, you're convinced it matters to whoever is trying not to be blown into fish food. Hours drag like days. The battle rages with deafening booms and acrid smoke. Then as suddenly as it began, the enemy ship turns, retreating downriver. Cheers erupt, though you're too busy trying not to collapse onto the planks. When you finally stumble ashore, the ground feels strange, solid yet swaying beneath you. You whisper to yourself that muskets and mud almost seem preferable. Almost. Because after one day on a warship, you know, you wouldn't last a week at sea either. The battlefield has left you rattled, the sea has left you queasy, and now you find yourself tangled in a quieter but equally maddening war, the war of money. You're handed your pay in crisp sheets of continental currency, and for a brief, shining second, you feel rich. Then you wander into town and discover that your fortune is about as useful as a pile of autumn leaves. Here's the mainstream fact. Continental Congress printed massive amounts of paper money to fund the war. But without gold or silver backing, it quickly lost value. By 1781, inflation was so wild that the phrase, "not worth a continental," became a bitter joke. You slap a few notes onto a tavern counter, proud of your earnings, only to have the innkeeper laugh in your face. "This won't buy you yesterday's stew bones," he says, pushing the bills back like they're contaminated. You sigh, tuck them into your pocket, and wonder if they'll at least make decent fire kindling on a cold night. The quirky tidbit? Some soldiers actually did use the worthless paper as wallpaper or even playing cards. Imagine decorating your home with money, only to have it peel off the walls in damp weather. You glance at your crumpled notes and think, at least a deck of cards would give me something to do between drills. Historians still argue whether Congress's reckless printing was a necessary evil or a catastrophic blunder. Some say the worthless paper bought just enough supplies to limp the army along until foreign aid arrived. Others claim it nearly unraveled the rebellion before it could succeed. As you finger the notes fragile as dried leaves, you lean toward blunder. Meanwhile, promises of back pay hang over you like storm clouds. Officers assure you that someday Congress will reward your sacrifices with real silver. You chuckle, then remember you're supposed to be serious. The truth is, soldiers desert not only because of hunger, but also because their wages mean nothing. Morale dips lower than your powder horn on its last charge. By night, you sit by the fire, watching a man fold worthless bills into origami birds. Another joke's about starting a collection. You add your own note to the flames, watching it curl into ash. For a moment, the fire flares bright, and you think, At least your money finally bought you a little warmth. Winter clamps down like a heavy lid, sealing away whatever warmth you thought you had left. Snow crunches beneath your worn boots, each step colder than the last. You drag yourself into Valley Forge with thousands of others, not to fight, but to survive. The camp sprawls in ragged rows of huts, smoke drifting weakly from chimneys that can't quite keep the frost out. Here's the mainstream fact. During the winter of 78, roughly 12,000 soldiers camped at Valley Forge. Supplies were scarce, disease rampant, and yet this miserable place became a crucible that reshaped the Continental Army. You duck inside a hut cobbled from logs and mud. The roof leaks, the floor is frozen dirt, and your blanket feels thinner than a biscuit. Around you, men cough, groan, and shift miserably. The only fire sputters in the hearth, too weak to chase away the drafts sneaking through every gap. The quirky tidbit: soldiers sometimes boiled leather from shoes or belts into a foul stew when rations ran out. You look at your boots and mutter, "Not yet, buddy," as if the leather itself can hear you plotting its future in a soup pot. Then comes the drilling. Into this frozen misery strides Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben, a Prussian officer with a sharp eye and a vocabulary of curses so colorful they require translation. He barks, waves his sword, and insists you repeat maneuvers until your frozen fingers feel like snapping twigs. Left, right, fire, reload. Over and over, until the movements seep into your muscles like stubborn rhythm. Historians still argue whether Valley Forge was truly the desperate low point popular memory paints, or whether the suffering has been exaggerated into legend. Standing here, toes numb, belly hollow, you don't need debate. Your body is evidence enough. Yet amid the hardship, you sense something shifting. The drills bring order. The huts, miserable as they are, offer shelter. The shared suffering binds you with men who just weeks ago were strangers. Around the fire, someone cracks a joke about von Steuben inventing new curse words daily, and laughter spreads like a spark in dry tinder. As snow drifts against the hut, you lie on the frozen ground, huddled close to others for warmth. You whisper to yourself that if you can survive this winter, maybe you can survive anything. The camp creaks, groans, and breathes in the dark, a battered heart refusing to stop. The thaw comes slowly, dripping from the eaves of huts and soaking into mud that swallows boots whole. With it comes another weight: exhaustion. Men begin to vanish from the rolls, not from battle, but from desertion. One day you drill beside a neighbor, the next his bunk is empty, blanket folded as though he meant to return. Here's the mainstream fact. Desertion was rampant in the Continental Army. Estimates suggest tens of thousands slipped away over the course of the war, some returning to farms, others vanishing into the wilderness, a few even switching sides. The army staggered forward, always bleeding men faster than it could replace them. You hear whispers in the night. Someone swears he'll leave at dawn, slipping past sentries. Another says he's already gone, pointing to a cold spot where a man once slept. You clutch your musket tighter, as though holding on to it will keep you anchored. The quirky tidbit: punishments for deserters could be dramatic. Sometimes mock funerals were staged, where soldiers carried coffins behind the accused to shame him before the real sentence fell. You imagine the surreal scene of marching with your own coffin, trailing you like a grinning shadow. It doesn't make you feel any braver. Discipline hardens. Officers order floggings for petty theft, lashings for drunkenness, even executions for repeat deserters. The crack of the whip echoes across camp, sharp as any musket volley. Men flinch, avert their eyes, and mutter under their breath. You feel your stomach twist, not only at the pain inflicted, but at the silent knowledge that fear is the glue holding this fragile force together. Historians still argue whether harsh discipline held the army together or drove more men away. Watching a soldier tied to a post, back streaked with red, you're certain both are true. Fear binds, but it also corrodes. One night, you're jolted awake by the soft crunch of footsteps outside. You freeze, heart pounding, certain you're about to witness a desertion. You want to stop it, but your legs remain leaden. The sound fades into the dark, and by morning, the bunk across from you is empty. No trace, no goodbye, just absence. As spring spreads green across the land, you march again. The army is leaner, quieter, the empty spaces between ranks speaking louder than any drum. You trudge on, wondering not for the first time how much longer you can hold on before the road swallows you too. The first time you hear French drums, you think you're dreaming. The rhythm is sharper, quicker, with a bounce unlike the steady thud of your own. Then you catch sight of bright uniforms, blues trimmed with white, officers with elegant plumes, and realize this war has just become far more crowded. Here's the mainstream fact. France officially allied with the American cause in 1778, sending troops, ships, and supplies. Their involvement shifted the war from a colonial rebellion into an international conflict that forced Britain to stretch itself thin across the globe. You shuffle awkwardly as French officers stride past, gesturing with broad sweeps of their hands, voices tumbling in words you can't decipher. A translator shouts explanations, but by the time you've grasped the order, half the men have already moved. You mutter, "Parlez-vous confusion," under your breath, earning a snicker from the soldier beside you. The quirky tidbit, Marquis de Lafayette, barely 20 years old, became a beloved figure among American troops. His youthful enthusiasm and willingness to share hardships made him something of a camp celebrity. You once spot him riding through camp, cape fluttering, and think he looks more like an actor in a play than a commander. Foreign accents mingle in campfire's glow. German officers like von Steuben bark clipped commands. Frenchmen sing songs you don't know, and suddenly your ragtag army feels like a patchwork quilt stitched from scraps of the old world. You're not sure if it's comforting or chaotic, probably both. Historians still argue whether foreign aid truly saved the revolution or whether American grit would have triumphed eventually. But as you chew on a chunk of French bread, chewier, saltier, and far tastier than hardtack, you're leaning towards saved. Marching alongside French soldiers, you notice their polished boots, their crisp uniforms, and their easy laughter even after a long day. You glance at your own tattered coat and think, maybe this alliance is also a fashion upgrade. Still, when cannon fire rumbles in the distance, you remember that shared danger outweighs style. By night, you watch sparks fly into the dark sky as French and American voices blend in song. You can't follow the words, but the melody seeps into your bones. A reminder that this fight is bigger than your own weary steps. Bigger than muskets, hunger, or even the snow you survived. For the first time, you feel the shadow of an empire shifting, and you're standing right in the middle of it. Summer heat presses down as you march southward, the air thick with dust and the faint sweetness of scorched fields. The war here feels different, sharper, like a blade turned sideways. The neat lines and booming volleys you once endured are rare. Here, the fighting clings to the land itself, twisting through swamps, pine woods, and endless farms. Here's the mainstream fact. The Southern theater of the Revolution became infamous for brutal skirmishes, burned crops, and shifting loyalties. Battles like Camden, Cowpens, and Kings Mountain were smaller than northern clashes, but often more vicious, turning the region into a patchwork of devastation. You tramp through a farmstead blackened to ash. Smoke still curls from fence posts, and charred corn stalks crumble under your boots. A woman stands in the ruins of her home, arms crossed, eyes like flint. She doesn't curse you, doesn't speak at all, just stares. You realize it doesn't matter which side burned her home. The war itself has already claimed her loyalty, turning it to cinders. The quirky tidbit? Some militia fighters earned the nickname swamp foxes, darting in and out of marshlands like ghosts. Francis Marion was the most famous, leading men who slipped through reed-choked waterways, striking supply lines before vanishing again. You imagine trying to fight while knee-deep in swamp muck, mosquitoes feasting on every inch of skin. Frankly, you'd surrender to the bugs first. Ambushes snap like traps. One moment you're marching along a dusty road, the next shots explode from the tree line. Smoke curls between branches, muskets crack, and men scatter in every direction. You dive into the dirt, heart hammering, praying the next volley doesn't find you. Historians still argue whether the Southern campaign was decisive in breaking Britain's will or just another draining extension of an already stretched conflict. To you, under a sweltering sun with blisters rising in your boots, it feels decisive enough. At night, you huddle in a barn, ears still ringing from the day's ambush. Outside, cicadas sing like saws, an endless buzz that makes you restless. You think of the cold at Valley Forge and almost miss it. Almost. Because here, the heat, the smoke, and the sudden crack of unseen muskets gnaw at your nerves in ways winter never could. By dawn, you're on the road again, stepping over scorched earth that seems to whisper, "You wouldn't last a week here either." The road narrows, the dust thickens, and suddenly every step pulls you closer to a name whispered in camp with both dread and hope: Yorktown. You've trudged through snow, mud, and swamps, but this feels like the final act, though no one dares to say it aloud. When you arrive, the air already quivers with tension. British forces are entrenched, cannons bristling like teeth. You and your comrades are handed shovels, not muskets, and told to dig. So you dig, trenches, zigzags, earthworks. The soil clings to your sweat-soaked shirt, and blisters bloom on your palms. Each night, you burrow closer to the enemy like stubborn moles. Here's the mainstream fact. The siege of Yorktown in 1781 pinned General Cornwallis's army between American and French land forces and the French fleet at sea. After weeks of bombardment, Cornwallis surrendered, effectively ending major combat in the Revolution. The quirky tidbit: during the siege, French troops performed elaborate musical parades, complete with drums and fifes to keep morale high. One American joked that the French made war sound like a street festival. You smirk at the thought, though right now your idea of festivity is bread not crawling with weevils. Night falls and the bombardment begins. Cannons roar, hurling iron across the dark, sparks lighting the sky like angry stars. The ground trembles beneath you, dirt raining into the trench as you huddle low. Smoke creeps over the parapets, acrid and thick, and you cough until your chest aches. Historians still argue whether Yorktown was truly inevitable once France entered the war, or whether sheer exhaustion on all sides made surrender the only path left. To you, shivering in a trench while red-hot shot hisses overhead, inevitability feels irrelevant. Survival is the only thing that matters. The days stretch, each marked by more digging, more cannon fire, more hunger. You march forward at night to storm enemy redoubts, bayonet fixed, heart hammering, as you climb over earthworks under a hail of musket fire. The chaos is brief but searing: shouts, flashes, smoke, and then the redoubt is yours. You collapse in the dirt, alive but trembling. When the white flag finally rises over the British lines, the camp exhales as one. Drums beat, flags ripple, and whispers spread. It's over, or at least this part is. You watch British soldiers march out, their faces pale, their muskets stacked in surrender. Dust swirls at their feet, carrying the taste of an empire crumbling. You should feel triumph, but mostly you feel hollow, too tired, too thin, too used to loss to cheer. You murmur, "I wouldn't last a week more of this." And for the first time, you suspect you're right. The smoke drifts away slowly, like fog rising off a river. Yorktown fades behind you, but the war does not snap shut like a book. Peace comes at the pace of dripping water. Months pass, then years before treaties are signed, before flags shift, before you're told it's finally finished. In the meantime, you linger in limbo. The army shrinks as men slip homeward, walking roads that lead back to farms long neglected. You think of your own field, maybe overrun with weeds, maybe seized by predators. What waits for you isn't clear, but the yearning for quiet, for bread without worms, for sleep without gunfire, becomes a constant hum in your chest. Here's the mainstream fact. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 officially ended the revolution, granting the United States recognition as an independent nation. 2 years passed between Yorktown and that ink on parchment. For the rank-and-file soldier, those years felt endless. The quirky tidbit? When the treaty finally reached America, celebrations included bonfires, parades, and even the ringing of church bells for hours on end. You imagine the sound rattling every window pane, a chorus so loud it must have spooked every barn cat in town. Yet beneath the noise, uncertainty lingers. Pay is scarce, promises of land or pensions hang in the air like smoke. You and your fellow soldiers glance at one another with tired eyes. Was it worth it? Historians still argue whether the revolution truly improved life for the ordinary soldier, or whether elites simply swapped one empire's crown for their own hats of power. At night, you lie on your cot, staring at the canvas roof of a tent that has sheltered too many seasons. You listen not to cannon fire, not to drums, but to silence. The quiet feels heavier than noise, pressing on you with questions that won't fade. What was gained? What was lost? And what of all the men who never walked home? The campfire flickers, sparks climbing into the dark. You think of Valley Forge, of swamp ambushes, of French bread and mock funerals. You think of snow crunching under starving feet, of desertions whispered into the night, of final surrenders that tasted more like exhaustion than victory. And you realize you really wouldn't have lasted a week, not in winter, not in summer, not in the endless gray between. But you did last, at least in this telling, long enough to see the war's edge soften, long enough to drift finally into the possibility of peace. And now, as the echoes of muskets fade into memory, let your shoulders ease, your breath deepen. Picture the fields no longer trampled by armies, but blooming again with quiet green. Imagine the roads you marched returning to dusty stillness, only the sound of crickets keeping watch. The war, with all its hunger and noise, slips farther behind, like a storm cloud carried out to sea. Your body is no longer cold in a hut or blistered on a southern road. It is here, resting safe, carried gently by time itself. Every step of that long march has slowed, until there is nowhere left to go, only the comfort of stopping. The voices of history soften now, their debates hushed, their arguments distant. What remains is calm, the rhythm of your own breath, steady as a drumbeat, quiet as falling ash. So let your mind wander across those empty battlefields, not with fear, but with ease, knowing the story's finished, the burden lifted. The revolution is no longer yours to endure. It is only a tale drifting away on the night air, leaving you free to rest. Good night, my friend. Sleep well.